So, this topic is called Beyond Behavior Promoting Safety and Connection in Moments of Dysregulation. And I have my friend Dr. Diamond back on. She was with us a few years ago, and we're so grateful to have her back again. So, thank you, Dr. Diamond, for coming.
Absolutely. Thank you for bringing me back again. It's always a pleasure to talk with you.
And do you prefer Dr. Diamond or Dr. Rashad? Which one do you prefer people call you by?
I prefer Dr. Diamond, but it's fine either way.
It's very catchy. I just want to make sure that I'm being respectful, but I love
Yeah,
Dr. Diamond in general.
thank you. Yeah, and it's just I think it's because I work in pediatrics. I just prefer people to just
Yeah.
say my name, not to be too formal. So yeah.
That's awesome. Well, since I have you on, why don't you go ahead and share your background information and then I'll share mine after you.
I am Diamond Rashad. My pronouns are she, her, and I am a neurodivergent pediatric occupational therapist. And I've been working in this field for 8 years now. It doesn't feel like it, but it is true. And I've wanted to be OT for so long. So it just at this point feels like it has been meant to be. I'm also a disability advocate and have experience working as a doula and working with new moms and new parents. And from that, I've also been very conscious of making sure that I'm family focused and leaning into a trauma informed lens to protect and support not only a child when I'm working in pediatrics, but also the whole family. I have experience with feeding, with sleep patterns, with sensory integration and modulation, and just supporting that regulation. And then also supporting neurodivergent families, neurodivergent children and their families, and also like neurodiverse families as well, when you have just people with different diagnoses and just figuring out what works best for individuals. So I'm very passionate about what I do. I love to make sure that everyone has access to those tools and access to learn more about neurodiversity, to learn more about occupational therapy and sensory supports, because we all can benefit from sensory support. So I'm excited to be here and I'm grateful to share.
We're so glad to have you. Thank you for sharing your background. And my name is Vanita Litvak. I go by she, her, and the host of the Speechy Side Up podcast. I have a passion for AAC and literacy. I've had the opportunity to speak at several conferences and co-author the Lou Knows What to Do book series. And when I'm not being an SLP, I enjoy playing tennis and having tea parties with my toddler.
I
I'll
love
read
that.
my financial disclosure. Thank you. And then I'll have you read yours. I have ownership interest in Speechy Side Up LLC and Tassel Learning LLC, and I'm an affiliate for Simple Practice and Meaningful Speech. I'm also a member of ASHA. And how about you, Dr. Diamond?
For me, I am being compensated for this presentation, and I may earn affiliate commissions if I'm using a link and someone
Mhm.
happens to click on it. So that is my investment in this.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that. And then we have started with some introductions and backgrounds. Then we're going to get into cultivating connections in therapy settings, recognizing signs of dysregulation, how to create a supportive, connected environment, and then you'll share some relational approaches to achieving goals, and we'll wrap up with some references and closing remarks. So, by the end of this presentation, we hope that you'll be able to describe at least two strategies to cultivate connections in therapy settings, define two signs of dysregulation that may indicate a child is struggling, list two or more strategies to foster a supportive and connected environment during therapy, and identify two relational approaches that positively impact therapy goals and two strategies to avoid. All right, so let's dive in. Let's talk about what strategies can be used to cultivate connections in therapy settings.
Yes, and this is a great question because it all starts with creating a child-centered environment, understanding a child's unique needs and what you can bring to the table when you walk into a classroom, into a clinical setting, and in the home environment as well. And so you want to think about when you're working with the child, how you can best connect with them. And that starts with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So thinking about things like the lower level needs like food, water, safety, all those things need to be met first before those higher needs can be fulfilled. And that higher need would be, for example, connection and being able to establish, like, once you feel safe, do you have that sense of connection and sense of belonging? And if a child does not feel safe in an environment, it doesn't feel like they have those basic needs met, either out in the community or when they come into a medical setting. That can be very overwhelming to start with, or if a family feels that as well. So, what we can bring to the table and make sure that we are building that rapport and building up that child. Some other things to think about as well when you're thinking about rapport is how can you collaborate with the caregiver? So, starting off with not just collaborating with the child, but also getting to know the family. What are their preferences? What do they like to play with? Do they have certain toys that they like to gravitate towards more at home? And if you don't know, and if a parent doesn't know, that's a great time to observe as well and jump in and look and see what they gravitate towards. So being able to collaborate, ask those questions is really, really important. And so when you do that, you want to move slowly. So before you take action, you're asking questions, you're making sure that you have choices for the child so that you can see what they gravitate towards. And then that way it'll be easy for you to build that relationship and see what things that you can create in that environment to make them feel safe and supported. Using routine is great. So starting off with not necessarily the same activities, but the same order of things. So, for example, one thing I like to do is have a shoe pin in the clinical setting. And so that way they know when they come in, they took off their shoes. That means that they can get comfortable, they can relax. It's not going to be so formal. And then usually we'll do a lot of movement at the beginning. And then we might do things that are more structured towards the end, usually guiding them towards a table if they feel regulated enough to do that. And then at the end, usually we'll do a transition activity. Maybe it's bubble, something that they can do before they put on the shoes and walk out the door. So again, it's not the same activity because I don't want any client to feel bored of an activity, to feel too stuck in an activity if they're going to, grasp too tightly to that. So definitely in the same order, but not the same activities unless it's something that they need. But that is something that can be helpful, especially for children who have sensory sensitivities or avoid sensory input when they know the order of things and they know what to expect when they walk into a session. So knowing what to expect and not being so worried or anxious about that can be a great way to cultivate that connection because it makes it easier to build a bond. There's other things you can use as well. Being curious, looking to see why a child plays with a certain toy or how long they play with a certain toy, not just assuming, oh, they only play this way, they only stack blocks this way, but being curious about why certain things are happening. If you set out an activity, if you're doing a puzzle, for example, and they don't gravitate toward it, being curious about why. That can be a great way to cultivate a connection because you're not writing any child off. You're just making sure that you are being curious and looking into being a detective almost and trying to figure out, okay, well, if they don't lean into this activity, then why? And what other activities can I use to get to know the child, to meet those goals, and take that next step in their therapy plan. Another thing I would say that can be very helpful is matching the energy. So if a child moves really slowly, in a therapy session, it's really important that you move so slowly too, especially if a child gets dysregulated easily. It's important to move slow, introduce things slowly, introduce changes slowly. And on the opposite end, if a kid has high energy and needs to move through things quickly, is you can have an upbeat manner, you can have a little bit more energy into how you engage with the child, not to the point where you're, making them hyperactive and even more excited, but you can match their energy and make sure that they feel that they have someone that they can play alongside with and they feel like this is someone who I can build trust with. So those are some things that you can use that can be really helpful.
Those are great tips. I have some follow-up questions. It's funny that you mentioned that you have your kids take off their shoes before they come in your session because my toddler would be like immediately more comfortable if she was able to do that in going into classroom setting or any setting. Why is that? What is significant about that for, let's say, a younger age, maybe like 4 to whatever you recommend?
Yeah, I would say, and that's a good point that you mentioned the age range, because usually it's between 3-year-olds to probably around 12 to 13-year-olds where they don't want to take off their shoes, which is
Mhm.
totally fine. We make accommodations for that, especially if they're on like sensory equipment. But I think it's because you get to be more relaxed. You get to stretch out your feet. It's kind of like you when you get home almost. You're
Mhm.
going to a place that's really structured, maybe at work or at school, and you have to be very structured and very to the point in things that you do. And so I think taking off your shoes introduces flexibility, makes you feel like you have options in what you can do, makes you feel like it's not going to be you're not going to always be at the table. You're going to be doing things that you don't need your shoes for. I think it reminds kids of play settings. Like if you go to, I don't know if everybody has Chuck E. Cheese, but all those play gyms and things like that, it reminds them of that, and being able to relax. So I think they associate shoes off with having the opportunity to play.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I imagine too that between that age range, they are growing so much that their shoe size is probably changing
Mm,
overnight
yeah.
sometimes. Like I've noticed that with my daughter. I literally bought her size 8 recently, and then she couldn't even wear them because I literally grew overnight and we were already in the next size up. So, you're working with a lot of kids. If families have multiple children, it's possible they may have not caught up yet that their child is outgrown their shoes. So that could sensorily be uncomfortable for them. And the fact that they're able to kind of like let loose and relax, that might make them feel better, more
Yeah.
comfortable.
That's very true. Not only are they growing very frequently, that happens a lot all the time. And also, a lot of children have sensitivities where it's related to clothing, like their
Mhm.
socks feel too tight, their shoes feel too tight. So it is feels so much better to just take it off and get to be able to stretch out your feet, especially when you're going through that stage, like you said, where you're always outgrowing things. It gives the child room. And so I think in their head, they're like, okay, well, then I have room.
Yeah, that makes sense. I know it's a little harder for therapists who are working in the schools. I know there's safety concerns with not having shoes on, which is unfortunate because I think if you had to, you could run without shoes. But I guess, like, kind of see what you can do within your environment. If that's an option, then it might be a way to make kids feel more comfortable, like coming into your session if they're able to kind of let loose for a little bit.
If there's anything you can do to introduce comfort at the beginning of the session, whether that is a weighted blanket. If they're not taking off their
Mhm.
shoes, can they put something on? If they are wearing a jacket and they feel uncomfortable, do they have a place to hang it up? Things like that, where you can introduce comfort from the beginning so that they know this is a place for us to learn, but we're going to learn through play.
Okay, great tip. You said that like having consistency throughout the session and that like routine is important. Are you using a schedule or are you using more like beginning routines and ending routines for the session?
Yes, routines. So, beginning routines, this is something that we're going to start off with in some kind of way. And it doesn't have to be the same for every kid. You can start, once you get to know the kid, you can start a routine and adjust it. So, for some kids, for example, that may get dysregulated and it comes off as hyperactivity, like it feels like they're bouncing off the walls and they have a hard time with listening to anything that you say, or they hear it, but they don't process it. So for a kid like that, I might be sure to, in the beginning of the session, make sure that I have maybe an obstacle course or access to a trampoline, or being able to, not a trampoline, can we have stickers on the wall or those window clings, and they jump up and they take them down as you're calling out different words, things like that, so that they can get that movement in from the beginning. So that way, when they come into a therapy session, they expect that they're not going to just have me go straight to the table. They're going to let me be able to have fun first or be able to move my body before we get into the next activity. And then their head, once they have the expectation set, even if it's a different activity every time, they know it's going to be something that they're moving their body, and they're not going to have to sit and try to pay attention when their bodies are not ready for that yet. And then
Mhm.
on the opposite end, for an ending activity, if y'all are having like way too much fun and they don't want to
Mhm.
leave, they don't want to go back to class, some calming activities to introduce coming out the door and getting a move on. So those things can be based off of a child's interest. It can be based off of any sensory glimmers that they like. So glimmers can be things that provide that sensory encouragement to a child's sensory system, anything that catches their eye and makes them relax more. So that can be if they really enjoy visual input, if you all can do bubbles at the end, if y'all can do things like if they enjoy puzzles, if they enjoy painting, if they enjoy doing animal walks out the door. Animal walks is a great thing to walk right out the door with it. If they like music, that's a great one. So using things and visual tools to help them realize, okay, this is the part where we're winding down and we're going to go on to the next thing. That can be very helpful.
Awesome. Those are great suggestions. Thank you. And then the other thing that you said was to make sure that you're matching your energy with the child. And you kind of alluded to this. So I imagine you're going to say yes. After we match our energy with the child, should we also be trying to get them into a place where they're ready to learn by using calming strategies or more exciting strategies?
I would say yes and no. So it depends on what energy you're trying to match.
Okay.
So if you are matching a child's social energy, if they come into a classroom or they come into a room and they feel a bit shy or they're a bit slow to approach toys or they're not too sure about collaborating with you on an activity, they feel a little bit rigid with that, then it's okay to, continue to match that energy and not try to bring them out of that space until they're ready for it. So you're setting up those tools to have them build more trust on their own over time. And
Mhm.
then on the other end, if you're thinking about energy as far as if they feel a bit lethargic or if they feel a bit hyperactive, that is when you're going to try to be as neutral as you can. So you don't want to match them necessarily, but you want them to not feel ashamed of where they are. Like if they are just having a hard day and they have a hard time regulating, it is what it is. We're going to try to help you get those sensory supports the best way that we can. So if they feel like they're bouncing off the walls, then you can be like, wow, like you are really into jumping on the trampoline today. We cannot get you off the trampoline today. It really looks like you need a lot of, extra support. So that would be a good time to like acknowledge it and then introduce activities that can help get them a little bit more to neutral as well. And we can get into that as later.
Yeah, that's really important because I've heard possibly from non-occupational therapists that we should be, depending on where the client is at, like trying to get them into this optimal zone of learning by using certain strategies. But it makes a lot of sense that it depends on what energy you're trying to match, what your relationship actually looks like with that child. And I think you mentioned, which is also very important, like not shaming them for feeling a certain way that day, just kind of honoring them where they're at and trying to just support them versus trying to get them to do something, to get them to be in a mood that you need them to be in to learn. Does that make sense?
Yes, it
Okay.
does. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think the more we learn about neurodiversity and how different brains learn, we also are learning that that zone of learning is different for everybody. So sometimes that zone is smaller, or sometimes that zone is perhaps the same width, but maybe it also appears that that zone of learning happens when they have more hyperactivity or they have more movement. So when they are able to move more, that is when you see a lot more language. That's when you see a lot more being able to have that emotional regulation or access executive functioning more when they are in different states of regulation as far as it goes is with hyperactivity. So yeah, I think we're learning more about how to best help kids. And sometimes that can look different, and it might not always end up where you have them in a swing for a few minutes and then they're able to sit at a table. It doesn't always work like that for all kids. Sometimes it takes a combination of things, and sometimes it takes, doing activities on the floor to find the best fit for them. And sometimes that zone might not happen as frequently or for the length that we always think it will.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing those. So let's talk about some signs of dysregulation.
Yes, there are so many. I tried to pick a few to go on the screen, but what I really wanted to share with everyone is not only some signs of dysregulation, but also some smaller signs of dysregulation, especially when it comes to it appearing as a willful behavior, something that a child is doing on purpose because it's something that you see with other kids as well, or things that a kid might do when they are regulated as well. So it can be a bit confusing. So one example is silly outbursts. So a child covering their eyes or the ears and going la 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 la, I can't hear you, or pretending to be an animal going underneath the table and saying, I'm not Miss Diamond. I am a kitty cat, and that's why I can't come to the table and work on my language today. So doing things that are silly like that, or not saying anything at all, but just making animal sounds. Those are some things that can come up, and that's something that, again, children can do. But if you notice that it comes out of nowhere, or it comes out of a demand, we go back to being curious and figuring out, okay, what about this activity is causing an avoidant response? Because that's the coping mechanism that some children have appeared, that they have figured out, okay, well, this is something that can delay the activity, or can delay me getting to the point of higher dysregulation. So let me use it until I can figure out another coping strategy. Other things that can come up as well include repetitive actions increasing in intensity. This can be like increased fidgeting or increased picking. If a child is stimming, that is one thing for sure, and that's something that can be used as a regulation tool for many children. But if it looks like, for example, like if they're picking at their lip, if they are picking at their skin or their nails, and it's increasing and increasing, that is another sign of dysregulation, that they are showing you that something about the environment, about their day, about the activity is distressing them. And it's also important to know that when we think about regulation, it's not always what's in front of us that is the dysregulating piece. Sometimes it can be, again, like what happened that day. Many children do not start off their day regulated. Sometimes kids come into a school or come into a clinic already at 70 to 80%, where they're already on this the higher end of the scale, where they feel like any medium to small thing is going to tip them over. And so sometimes, even if the demand is small in an environment, if they have already felt overwhelmed by how loud a classroom has been, or how uncomfortable their shirt is, or feeling overwhelmed from the car ride, if they have vestibular sensitivities, if they have movement sensitivities, if they have auditory sensitivities, if they've been hearing things that are loud all day long, and then for, for example, if a therapist is talking about singing a song and it's not in the right key, or the right way that they feel like it should be sung based off their previous routines, if they're already dysregulated at 70 to 80%, even though it might not appear as much of a big deal, that is enough to bring out signs of dysregulation, because that's where they can't handle any more changes or any more ways to figure out how to problem solve through the situation. They're over it. So that's when you're going to see those things like covering your ears, avoidant responses, repetitive actions that are attempts to like self-soothe, um, increasing hyperactivity, where they are trying to either move their bodies to help regulate themselves and it's not working for them, or they are just trying to get that energy out and they don't know what to do with it, or they're trying to get away from the activity that is causing that tip over. Unable to respond to instructions is another one, where they are not able to process, even if they hear you and they know they understand, they understand. It doesn't mean that they're able to implement it or motor plan it. They might only be able to, they might not be able to hear you at that moment, even if they have had the skills before. So that's another sign of dysregulation, when I notice that the skills that they've had when they were regulated are being lost either on that day or based off previous days. Okay, there's something off with our regulation because some skills that we had before we're not able to access today. Other signs can be lethargic, like if they appear very sleepy, they keep putting their head down, they appear bored. Sometimes that comes off with, I'm overwhelmed, I can't do it anymore. So my brain is just gonna shut off. And actually I had a client when I was first working as an OT that whenever I worked with this child, they would fall asleep every single time. I was like, wow, this kid is so sleepy. Is it their nap time? Because they were a young child. So I'm like, maybe it's their nap time and we need to reschedule their appointment. And no, every time they got back in their car seat and went home, they just perked right up. All of a sudden, they felt so much better, but it was because I was giving them too much sensory input. We were doing things that were too loud. We were doing things that had too much movement, and they were so sensitive. Their sensory system was so sensitive, they could not handle it. So they just said, nope, I'm done. I'm just going to sleep. And you could not wake them up until you got them out of that environment because it was just too far gone. So like noticing those things before they completely like shut down, if they're just yawning and they're looking bored, making some changes then. Also on that end of basic needs of sleep, also if they're always hungry, making sure that they have access to food, but also if they're asking for a snack like every 10 minutes, then they're probably not hungry. They're probably just trying to find something crunchy to regulate because whatever is in front of them is not working for them. They're again, a lot of these things of dysregulation, these signs are a child's attempt to regulate when they don't know how. So they're like, let me try this and see what works, and maybe it doesn't work.
Well, and it's interesting just looking at these, a lot of these would be interpreted as challenging behaviors. I think for anybody who doesn't understand the signs of dysregulation. So, what happens if we use behavioral strategies to try to increase participation during these signs of dysregulation?
So a few things can happen, and usually what I see is a child goes into the fight, flight, fawn, or freeze response. So you're using these strategies and they either comply, so they fawn and they're like, okay, I'll just try to hold it in a little bit longer and get it together. And so I think that's why sometimes behavioral strategies appear to work, because a child has either been, in a therapy system for a while and knows what they need to do to get through something or to make an adult figure happy. I think that's something that has always been important for many children and for us adults growing up as well, that you did have people that you looked up to and you wanted to make people have positive attitudes towards you, especially if they're only showing those things when you do what they say. So fawn, that is definitely a response that can happen. But some other things that can happen as well is the fight. So those self-injurious behaviors can come out. That can be the time where kids become a little bit more rough, or what's another word for it? Not destructive, but they become more rough with toys and rough with themselves, and not even less aware of their environment and their bodies. And you can get that pushback from kids when you use behavioral strategies to try to make them participate and make them meet the demands of an environment. And on the other hand, you can also have the flight. So if they're not hiding under the table and you're using behavior strategies to get them out from the table, they might decide, okay, well, if I can't hide, if you're not going to let me decompress here, then I'm out of here. I'm just going to find another way to escape. So noticing those smaller behaviors beforehand can be very helpful, because it can lead to the elopement and those escaping behaviors as well, where those kids just, okay, if you're going to push harder, then I'm going to push even harder as well. So that's when you have that power struggle.
Yeah, like things we've all seen, I think, in our therapy sessions. Unless you're coming out of grad school and you're getting all of this amazing information now, I think, like, I've been doing this for 10 years and I look back at some of the things that I used to do and I'm like, why? But, as cheesy as it is, when you know better, you do better. And so hopefully by spreading this information, people, our therapists and educators will be willing to kind of change some of the things that they're doing so that we can spot these signs of dysregulation, stop looking at them as challenging behaviors, and instead look at it as, like, how do we support this child and how do we adjust the environment so that this child can be successful. You had said something like, when we're seeing those avoidant responses, want to start thinking about what about this activity is causing an avoidant response. What kind of things could be causing an avoidant response? I'm imagining like attention span for specific ages, but what else?
Yeah, so attention span can be one. For some kids, it can be self-esteem, especially if they have experienced the level of the activity before. And many kids know what they can and what they struggle to do. And so that self-esteem with something can be, okay, well, I already know that I'm not great at organizational skills, or I'm not great at pronouncing this letter. And this is what my mom works with me on and my teacher works with me on. So I really don't want to work on this letter today because I know I'm not going to be good at it. And I know that they're going to correct me about it. And be some things that are going on in the child's head as well. Those are some things to think about. And other things are being able to have, like you said, attention span, but also being able to split their attention or divide their attention between two components of an activity. If they have to search, for example, if you're doing a puzzle and you've perhaps maybe mixed the two puzzle pieces together, two puzzles together, and they have to try to figure out how to separate the two. If they have a hard time with visual scanning or a hard time with remembering the recall of activity, especially if it's multiple steps, that can be something that can be overwhelming. If it is an activity that is used to talk about language and to work on those language goals, but perhaps it has a gross motor demand associated with it, or maybe it has a fine motor demand with it. If they're not able to pick up the pieces easily, that can be something that a child would avoid, even if there are other parts of an activity that they enjoy. If that part is difficult, that can be a reason to avoid it as well. So thinking about the cognitive demands, if it's executive functioning difficulties, motor planning difficulties, if it is emotional demands, so being able to do even like a small craft, if y'all are doing like a cute craft, if you're doing cutting and you're doing gluing and coloring, if they are feeling dysregulated and they don't have the regulation that day to be able to adapt their emotional response, and they feel frustrated easily with things being out of place, if they color outside the lines, if they put something in the wrong spot, if it doesn't look like the way you did it or like the way the model did it or the way he did it before, that can be dysregulating even more because they already don't have the capacity to deal with existing demands and now there's more demands. So that can be a reason that a child's like, ah, I'm done. I'm just gonna avoid it because I feel like I'm gonna mess it up and it's not gonna be how I want it to be.
Thank you for sharing all of those examples. I feel like that's very helpful for when we see that type of response. So now let's talk about the strategies we can use when we're noticing these signs of dysregulation and how we can foster and support children in these environments.
Yeah, so some things to keep in mind is that for many children, regulation is a tool that you learn, that you grow in. It's not something that comes automatically. And so that's why, we talk about things like when a baby is born, we have kangaroo care, and that's to have that skin to skin and match heartbeats and help regulate a baby's temperature and help regulate their nervous system by having that co-regulation with a caregiver and a supported adult. And so as we move from co-regulation, being able to have that physical comfort and moving into I can regulate myself and I can help myself get through challenging things, that is a journey. And sometimes it takes children, especially kids that are disabled, kids that have additional needs, especially when it comes to sensory needs, it can take time for them to get to self-regulation. And so that's why it's so important to foster that supportive environment, knowing that we are a part of that journey and not that regulation doesn't always happen overnight, having those tools and those strategies and that learning opportunity does not come out when a child is very dysregulated. And so because of that, it's very important to offer more prior to a shutdown or prior to a meltdown, like we talked about before with those smaller signs of dysregulation, before it gets to the point where a child is showing self-injurious behaviors or elopement, what things we can offer, how we can be more flexible, how we can offer choices, how we can adapt the environment before it gets to that point. And this is not to say in any way that this is foolproof at all. Sometimes there are things going on. We are just one part of the environment, right? So like I said, there are some things that are just happen in a child's day, in a child's week. They might have a toothache from
Mhm.
last week. And if they don't have the tools to communicate any body issues that are going on with them, there are many things that children come into a classroom or into a clinical setting and we don't know what's going on, but we know that something's off. And so even with all the tools that we provide, it doesn't mean that it's going to be 100% effective, but it can be supportive. So when those things do happen, it's important to provide less input and less sensory stimulation during those meltdowns and during those shutdowns. So that's when I'm talking less, I am lowering the lights even more, I am making sure that I'm helping their body regulate before I'm even trying to talk them through anything. So I'm trying to help their body more than help them to problem solve or use any regulation strategies that we've talked about before. So that can look like, how can I help regulate their breathing? How can I help regulate their heart rate? And those things come in through turning down the lights, talking less and showing more, encouraging movement, visually showing what tools are available, and going through those things beforehand as well to encourage movement and help the body. So showing beforehand that a trampoline is accessible, showing beforehand that a weighted blanket is accessible, or a sensory tent or sensory tunnel, or going under the table, showing that those things are okay to use when you're feeling overwhelmed. Also, some things to help as well. Strategies can be using physical exercise, using running, using deep pressure, using things that are heavy, like pushing a weighted ball, or pushing or kicking a large ball back and forth, using your physical body and your muscles to go back and forth and get that input into our joints and back to our brain to help our bodies calm down. And then I love bubbles. I know we all love bubbles, but using those things to help with breathing and taking those deep breaths, because we know saying calm down, we know saying, take a deep breath, that's going to make somebody do the opposite. So using activities and visual cues to help that relaxation and help that body get to a place where we can go back and introduce regulation strategies and things that can help a child move forward into that zone of learning. Other things can be environmental changes. So noticing what things can be triggering. And that goes back to, knowing our clients and what things can be alarming, what things are not a big deal, but making those changes, whether it's with the lighting, if we can. I love to turn off the lights and use flashlights if we can, because my clinic doesn't have windows, so sometimes we can't get that natural daylight in. If you can, that is amazing. So using things like that, using white noise, using familiar music, lo-fi music. Some of my kids love that kind of music, especially when they're just having a hard day. And we'll kind of go through a few things during times where we're just doing activities to see what things resonate with them more. And then caregiver coaching as well as a really important strategy to use to foster that connected environment, because we never want a family to feel like it only works in the classroom and it only works in the clinic. We want to come up with activities and strategies that can be carried over into the home environment, even if it's something that's small, if it is difficult, if it is, for example, a difficulty with transitioning out the door, then I can coach the parent on what regulation tool or what transition strategy we can use so that when they come get their child, they're the ones introducing the strategy, not me. And so that makes it more likely that they're able to carry it over. So for example, when I have had children have a hard time coming out the door, something that we came up with as a unit was for the parent to come into the session. We will talk about how they did that day and what things to work on at home. And we would have the child show a parent one of the activities that they did, like especially if it was a really fun or really engaging activity, we would demonstrate that and show them how to do it so that the kid is teaching them something. But also then to leave, we would have the parent introduce blowing out the birthday candle. So the parent holds up their fingers and say, okay, it's time to blow out the candles or blow out the lights in the sensory room. And so they'll take the fingers and blow out each one. And then as soon as the last one goes out, I turn off the lights and they walk out the door. And so that's something that they do together, not me and the child, so that they can use it in other situations as well. They're not thinking, oh, I only do blowing out the candles with Miss Diamond. No, you can do it with anybody you feel safe with. You can do it with your parents. You can do it with your grandparents. You can do it with your teacher. So that's some other things you can use.
I love that tip. Thank you for sharing that. I'm going to try that with my daughter. So how can we prioritize relational approaches to impact goals?
Yes, so something that I have been learning has been the spoon theory and recognizing, and this goes back into what we talked about earlier about the examples of what an activity requires and how much demand an activity might place on a child. And so recognizing how many spoons an activity can take, how many spoons it takes for, how much energy it takes for a child to complete an activity, and then how much effort does it take for a child with sensory sensitivities? How much time does it take for a child with sensory sensitivities, a language delay, and motor difficulties to engage in a classroom and then come into a therapy session or come into a clinical setting, especially if they have all those areas to think of. So considering that when we are introducing activities and when we modify activities, and that can be helpful because then we realize that we are not coddling a child, we are adapting for the child. And that can help impact goals because you can see where the progression is going. We're not completing a goal how I originally thought, but we can do it this way with these supports. We can do it with access to sensory tools. We can do it if we are in adaptive seating. And so knowing those things, especially if we are collaborating with other disciplines as well. So being able to see, okay, like they can really hit these language targets when they are in a swing or when they are in the ball pit. And so we're at this part in the goal. And so we are going to use that to work towards more mobile sensory supports because we can't take the ball pit everywhere we go. So what other ways can we use to help that child get that sensory input and then also help them progress in a way that's meaningful for them? And so it's important to remember that regulation is an adaptive process. And so from that, we need to adapt our process as well too. Because if we don't change, then how can we help them change their regulation or help them adapt their regulation and help them when they are regulated, be able to access those strategies so that they can be able to move towards that self-regulation piece that we want. Some other things to think of when you're thinking about when you're connecting with a child and you want to impact their goals is going back to knowing their sensory profile, knowing what makes them glimmer, what parts of their sensory profile that they really love, and what triggers that they have. And that helps you guide your decision making with goals, as well as collaborating with the family. Some things to avoid would be one, dismissing your own dysregulation. We all see it a lot more for various reasons where kids are having a hard time with going through those stages and going from no regulation, co-regulation to self-regulation. And so if you are constantly supporting people all day with emotional responses, with behavioral responses, with adaptive responses, you can feel that tensity like in your body, you can feel that overwhelm. And so making sure that you are addressing that yourself as well, using your own sensory supports, making sure you're not dismissing that because that can carry over into your sessions and that makes it harder for you to problem solve and you to figure out, okay, how can I best help this child if you're just always feeling super frustrated and you're having a hard time with knowing what to do next. That's very much like how our kids feel too. So making sure that we're modeling that and doing the same for ourselves and doing the same for caregivers as well, based off what we see.
Yeah. Is it fair to say that not only can it be dysregulating for an adult to support children in regulating their emotional needs throughout the day, but also just like environmental stimuli as well, whether it be like social media or the news or a conversation with, another person, that all of that can attribute to an adult's dysregulation as well. So like you mentioned, like just being very cognizant of that and how that is also carrying over into the sessions too.
Yes, that is absolutely very true. So not only like your own caseload, but the administrative demands that might come up,
Mhm.
as we work in this field, these fields, also anything personal, even if you just don't feel your best that day, if you feel like, like I feel under the weather, not forgetting that. And when you're powering through, like keeping that in mind. Sometimes if I'm having a difficult day, I'm just like not feeling the best. Like I just feel maybe super tired. I'm not sick, but I just don't feel the best. And I'm going to model that with my kids and say, we're going to work on your goals, but we're going to work on it this way because Miss Diamond cannot be running back and forth and doing this obstacle course with you and going in the tunnel. Like if I go upside down and I spin too fast, I'm going to get nauseous. So we're just not going to do it today. And like respecting that and honoring that for myself so that When a child is telling me, no, I don't want to get in the swing today, I don't want to do X, Y, and Z, or they're just telling me no, like, then I'm going to respect that too, because sometimes they might even say the same way that I've said it before. So that's important to know. And I've noticed, I don't know if you've seen this before, but I've also noticed that whenever I go on vacation, which is, something that it always depends on what's going
Mhm.
on with your clinical setting and what you can and can't do. But when I go on vacation and I come back and I have like taken time to relax and enjoy myself, my kids, I don't know if they just miss me, but I feel like I am so regulated that all my kids have the best week
Mhm.
in the entire world. I'm like, wow, how did they come? How did they do all these things this week? And I do feel like it's because when I have that break and I'm able to take a step back and become back more regulated, that we make a lot of progress, and that can also come, across with goals too. So taking a step back and saying, okay, why do I feel stuck? Why do I feel like I'm doing the same activities with this child? Who can I contact for mentorship? What activities can I introduce? How can I switch it up? Sometimes that can make a big, big difference.
Yeah, no, 100%. I totally feel that. And I also feel that like with my own daughter, if I feel like she's being really dysregulated or is showing signs of dysregulation, like I have to take a look at myself and my husband as well, and we'll kind of say, oh, like we were really anxious about this and maybe she was like feeding off of that, or I like woke up in a bad mood because I had been up multiple times that night, and when she was like coming in excited to wake up in the morning, I just wanted to like sleep in a little bit longer. So I definitely think that the adult's state of regulation has a big impact on the interaction with the child and the child's ability to regulate with that adult in their session, which makes it really challenging because, as you mentioned, like a lot of therapists are already overwhelmed with the administrative demands, with caseload demands. So we do have Rachel Archambault, who is a PTSD SLP, who's also speaking at this event, and she's talking about triggers and just being aware of your own triggers that probably contribute to dysregulation. And then having coping strategies, like you had mentioned, before the shutdown, right? So, like having your own set of coping strategies for your own triggers that you get you into a dysregulated state. So, I think we could do a whole separate presentation on how therapists can get regulated, right? To then
Yes.
be prepared to work in a session, but that's for another time.
Yes. Oh my gosh, that is very true. That could be a whole separate thing. Because it also reminds me of parents and caregivers as well, because if you have a child that's easily dysregulated and you are constantly, either you are the go-to parent for those things, like even if both parents are able to calm a child down, if a child has a preference on who they
Mhm.
go to and they go to that parent every single time, and you're doing that multiple times a day, then it's very easy for you to just stay dysregulated, or you stay in fight or flight, because you don't know if that's going to trigger your child. You don't know how to adapt the environment for your child because you're not in a state of learning. And I think many of our parents sometimes do not come into therapy sessions in a state of learning either. And so then it's hard to have that carry over if we're not addressing that regulation with adults as well. So I think you bring up a really, really good point.
Yeah. No, that's also another very good point. Yeah. Like any interaction is dynamic, right? So a lot of the times, if we're looking at it from a behavioral lens and we're doing ABC data, let's just say we're looking at what was the antecedent, what was the behavior and the consequence for the child. But also, we should be looking at ABC data for the adults with what we're saying right now, right? Okay, the therapist, what was their antecedent and what was their behavior? What was their reaction to the child? We're not doing that in this conference, but I'm just saying that, like, we need to be looking at it both ways.
Yes, for sure.
Yeah. You kind of touched on spoon theory. A couple of the other speakers have too. Can you just like expand on it a little bit more in case anybody's not familiar with it at all?
Oh, yes. Okay. The spoon theory is thinking about activities and daily routines as how many spoons, like spoons of energy it takes to complete something. And so this is something that comes up very frequently in the disability community is, for example, how much effort or how many spoons it takes to take a shower. So not only do you have to have the executive functioning to organize and plan out when you're going to take a shower, but if you have sensory issues, you also have to prepare for the change from it being hot to cold, from being dry to wet, and then getting out the shower. If you have any physical disabilities or you are easily fatigued, how many spoons it takes to stand in a hot shower for so long, that can be very tiring. And so the thought process is that we all come in starting off our day with a certain amount of spoons. And so if you only start off with 20 spoons that day and getting dressed and going to school takes 5, you're only going to have 15. School takes 10. You get home, you only have 5 spoons left, and you still need to have dinner. You need to listen to your parents. You need to get ready for bed. And so for some kids, by the time they get home, they might not have any spoons left to do anything. And so that's when you see those kids that might have more meltdowns when they get home. Some kids might come to school with 5 spoons from the start. And so it's hard for them to engage in things that have a lot of demands because they don't have the spoons for it. So the spoons refer to how much energy it takes, and that can apply to like cognitive energy, physical energy, like fatigue, sensory, sensory energy, like being able to adapt your responses based off their demands in your environment. So another one that might be similar is something that I learned in school was how much energy, like how much metabolic energy something takes. And like driving a car and showering were like one of those top ones that take a lot of energy. So like thinking about what things typically take a lot of energy, and then considering your diversity, what things might take more energy for people that have different brains and different learning styles, and how much spoons they might not carry over into the next day, and so they might not have any like a lot of spoons with to start.
Okay. Thank you for explaining that. So this might sound like very simplistic, but the way to replenish that energy, let's say like 15 of the 20 spoons are used in the morning, like do naps, do those things replenish energy? Like what replenishes the energy? I imagine like sleep has a lot to do with it. If you're saying by the next day your energy is replenished again.
It depends. So
Okay.
that's a good question, but I would say that from my understanding is that it doesn't necessarily rest can help, but it's more of the rest. So like being able to have restorative rest, either
Mhm.
through a nap or through the next day, or being able to adapt an activity so it takes less spoons and that you're able to conserve your spoons. So a part of the spoon theory is being able to conserve your spoons for those things that you have to do that day or you have to get through, or things that are your main concern, because if you run out, then you don't have energy for anything, or you don't have the regulation to get through anything. So yes, I would say that it's the restorative rest. And the challenge comes in is that when you're working with disabled children, are they able to get restorative rest? Are they
Mhm.
able to engage in sleep participation? Because for many children, it's hard for them to go to sleep and it's hard for them to stay asleep. And so if they're not having that, then they're not getting all their spoons back the next day.
Mm. Very fascinating. I'll definitely have to look into that more. Thank you for explaining that.
Yeah.
So here's your list of references. Anything in particular you want to highlight? Everybody will have access to this page too.
I would say that any of these would be great to check out. I think the yoga intervention is a great article, especially if you want to do some modified yoga poses to get that deep pressure and help with that regulation. And then also, as we're talking about trauma, looking at the last reference, self-regulation as a key factor against harmful effects of adverse childhood experiences. Sensory trauma is a thing, and so experiencing something over and over again and feeling overwhelmed by it, or feeling like you are forced to participate in something that has that trauma associated with it. Medical trauma is real as well. So thinking about think about that from that perspective as well when we're working with kids is how can we make sure that we are not forcing any adverse experiences on children when they might experience it like so many times already.
Okay. Thank you for explaining those. And where can everybody find and connect with you?
So you can connect with me on Instagram at a dime of OT. And you can also email me at drdiamond.ot@gmail.com or on my website, www.adimenot.com. And yeah, you can keep up with me that way.
Amazing. Dr. Diamond, thank you so much for coming back on. This was super informative, and I know people are going to walk away with some really great strategies from this one. So thank you.
So of course, thank you. I appreciate it.